I want to tell you a story tonight. Not the kind with dragons or distant galaxies, but something quieter, something real. A story that began not with a bang, but with the creak of wagon wheels, the flicker of candlelight, and the rustle of wind through colonial fields. Back then, the world felt wide, but not rushed. The towns were small, the winters long, and people still greeted each other by name. Children ran barefoot through apple orchards, and news traveled slowly by letter, by horse, by whispered word. The 13 colonies were still just that, colonies. Loyal mostly, British in law, if not always in spirit. Taxes were paid, tea was sipped, and on Sunday mornings, church bells rang out across the hills, like they had for generations. But something was stirring beneath all that calm. You could feel it if you listened closely, in the way a shopkeeper glanced at the latest notice from London, in the way neighbors spoke in quieter tones when they thought no one was listening. They did not know it yet, but the world they knew was about to slip away. And a new one, loud, messy, and full of fire, was waiting just beyond the dawn. Taxes, tea, and trouble. I remember when it began to change, not all at once, but slowly, like a kettle beginning to boil. At first it was just murmurs, letters from London, new rules, unfamiliar stamps pressed into paper. The Stamp Act, they called it. The first time we had to pay a tax, not decided by our own assemblies, but by men across the sea, who had never walked our roads or heard our voices. People grumbled, of course. No one liked paying more for a license, a newspaper, or a will. But it was more than that. It was the principle of it. The quiet understanding that something had shifted, that we were no longer just distant cousins in the empire. We were subjects expected to obey, not partners to be heard. Still, we petitioned. We wrote letters. We appealed to Parliament and to the King himself. Most of us still thought of ourselves as loyal. There were Union Jacks in the meeting halls and toasts to the Crown at weddings and taverns. But a seed had been planted. Then came the Townshend Acts. More taxes on glass, lead, paper, paint, and of course tea. They said it was for defense. We knew it was for control. Redcoats arrived to enforce it. They did not knock on our doors. They marched through our towns, slept in our homes, watched us from the corners of markets with hands resting on their muskets. Boston especially felt it. The tension there settled into the bones of the city like damp air in the stone. One day, a small crowd formed near the custom house. Words were shouted. Snowballs were thrown, maybe stones too. No one knows who gave the order. But the soldiers fired. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay on the ground. We called it a massacre. The Crown called it a mistake. People began to choose sides. Even tea became a symbol. The Tea Act gave a monopoly to the East India Company. It was meant to help them, but it undercut local merchants and reminded us once again who held the reins. The price was cheaper, yes, but it cost us our pride. And so one cold December night in 1773, a group of men slipped aboard 3 ships in Boston Harbor. Dressed roughly as Mohawk warriors, they worked in silence. Chest after chest of tea, 342 in all, was split and poured into the black water. No one was hurt. No theft, no fire. Just tea soaking into the tide like a quiet scream. The response from London was swift and punishing. They closed Boston's port, stripped away our ability to govern ourselves, ordered soldiers into our homes without permission. The coercive acts, they were called. But to us, they were intolerable. It was no longer just about taxes. Across the colonies, even in places far from Boston, men and women began to ask harder questions. What did it mean to be free? Who had the right to rule? Could loyalty survive silence, or was it something we had to earn together? People met in secret. Letters passed hand to hand. Riders galloped through the night with messages tucked in their boots. A congress was called, not by kings, but by commoners. They met in Philadelphia, unsure of what they might become. We still hoped for peace then, I think. Even with anger in our chests and redcoats on our streets, we wanted to believe there was a way back. That the king would listen. That he would see us, not as children needing discipline, but as people deserving dignity. But the tea had already sunk, and the tide, once it turned, was not so easy to stop. Shots in the dark. It was spring when the world tipped. The nights were still cold, but the days had begun to stretch longer, and with them came the uneasy feeling that something was coming. No one knew when or what form it would take. But the tension had grown too tight. It was only a matter of time before it snapped. The British had orders. They were to march from Boston to Concord, a quiet little town tucked among the hills, to seize weapons and arrest men thought to be stirring up rebellion. Samuel Adams, John Hancock. Names whispered like flint and tinder. The plan was quiet, secret. But secrets in those days had wings. That night lanterns glowed in the steeple of the Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea. There were two. Paul Revere rode out under the cover of darkness, his horse pounding the dirt roads as he warned the towns along the way, the regulars are coming. Not the British, they were all still British then, but the king's men, soldiers with bayonets and orders. In Lexington, as dawn broke, the militia gathered a small group farmers, mostly tired men with muskets they barely knew how to aim. They stood in the damp grass, while bird song filled the trees. No one expected a fight. They stood not to shoot, but to be seen, to say without words that they would not back down. Then came the redcoats, hundreds of them, their coats bright against the pale morning. A few shouts, a command maybe, and then a shot. No one knows who fired first. Some say it was a mistake. Some say it was fate. But that single crack split the silence of the colonies forever. The British opened fire. 8 men from Lexington lay dead. The survivors scattered into the woods, hearts pounding, blood hot. The soldiers moved on toward Concord. But the road back would not be so easy. Word spread faster than horse or drum. Militia poured from fields and forests, muskets in hand-eyes, sharp with purpose. At the North Bridge in Concord, they stood their ground, and this time they fired back. British soldiers fell. The rest began to retreat, but the path home was a gauntlet. Every tree, every stone wall, every bend in the road held a colonist ready to fire and vanish. By the time the sun set, nearly 300 British soldiers had been killed or wounded, and the world had changed. This was no longer protest, no longer politics. It was war. Families listened that night to the quiet outside their doors, wondering what would come next. Some fathers sat by candlelight cleaning their muskets. Some mothers packed what little they had, preparing to flee if the fighting reached them. No one slept easy. The shot that rang out on Lexington Green had not just killed men. It had shattered the illusion that we could go back. And from that moment on, every step we took was toward something unknown, something dangerous, and maybe something worth it. The rebellion takes shape. It is one thing to fire a shot. It is another to realize there is no turning back from it. In the days after Lexington and Concord, the countryside pulsed with movement. From New Hampshire to the Carolinas, word of the battles traveled faster than ever before, not just through printed broadsheets or tavern talk, but through a deeper, quieter current, one made of fear resolve, and something that felt almost like destiny. Men left their fields. Boys who had never held a musket shouldered them with trembling hands. Fathers kissed their children, not knowing if they would return. From towns and farms and dusty crossroads they made their way to Boston on foot, on horseback, with little more than powder bread, and a conviction they did not yet have words for. What began as pockets of resistance quickly became something larger. Boston was surrounded. The city, once a heartbeat of trade and chatter, now lay under siege, not by an army in uniform, but by thousands of volunteers in mismatched coats and homespun shirts. They came with courage, more than training hope, more than ammunition. And yet they stood. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, not long after. The delegates arrived weary-eyed, their carriages mud-splattered from long roads. There was no blueprint for what came next, just questions, arguments, and a deepening sense that the storm had broken. It was here that a name first rose above the din: George Washington. He was not the most eloquent speaker. He was not from Boston, nor particularly known for fiery politics. But he had something else, a stillness, a presence, a way of listening that made others fall silent. He wore his old military uniform to the Congress, not out of pride, but out of purpose. When he was chosen to lead the Continental Army, he did not smile. He did not boast. He simply bowed his head and said he would accept the burden if it was God's will. He left for Boston almost immediately. His arrival there was quiet, as so many turning points are. He found a force of men with little coordination and even less discipline. They were brave, yes, but bravery without structure is a short-lived thing. Washington brought order, slowly, gently, but firmly. He drilled them, organized them, gave them leaders, and demanded more of them than they had ever been asked to give. He also gave them belief that this ragged line of farmers and blacksmiths could one day stand against the might of the British Empire. And while Washington shaped the army, the rebellion itself began to take form in the hearts of the people. There were still loyalists, of course, men and women who believed the crown would make things right. Families found themselves split. Neighbors eyed each other with unease. Church congregations sang the same hymns, but wondered who among them might be carrying news to the other side. In taverns, people spoke in lower tones. In homes, children were told not to repeat what they heard at the table. Spies were not just something from stories, they were real and often invisible. Yet for all the uncertainty, something had begun to settle in the idea that we were no longer simply subjects resisting taxes. We were something else now, a movement, a people. Not quite a nation, at least not yet, but you could feel it rising, in the silence between musket drills, in the scratch of pens signing letters to London, in the prayers whispered before sleep asking for strength, not just survival. There was no declaration yet, no flag to rally behind, just scattered campsites, worn boots, and a growing sense that what had begun as defiance might become something far greater. We did not know what to call it, but we knew what it felt like, and that somehow was enough. A declaration of something new. There are moments when the world changes, not with the roar of cannons, but with the scratch of a pen. By the summer of 1776, the colonies were no longer whispering about independence. They were arguing about it, loudly, passionately, sometimes bitterly. Not everyone agreed. Some still hoped for reconciliation. Others feared chaos. But the tide had turned, and the shore behind us was already too far to swim back to. The fighting had grown fiercer. Blood had soaked into the dirt at Bunker Hill. The siege of Boston had tightened and cracked, and Washington's steady stern, unshaken, had driven the British from the city. For the first time, it felt like we might not just resist, we might win. But to win, we had to name what we were fighting for. So the delegates gathered once more in Philadelphia, in that hot fly-buzzed hall on Chestnut Street. The Second Continental Congress. 50-odd men, some farmers, some lawyers, many of them tired, all of them aware that whatever they did would echo long after they were gone. They appointed a committee to draft a declaration. Among them was a tall, red-haired Virginian with a quiet voice and a sharp pen, Thomas Jefferson. He was just 33. He wrote in a rented room hunched over by candlelight, the sound of hooves and hammers drifting through the window. He borrowed ideas from the Enlightenment, from Locke, from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. But what he created was something more than borrowed. It was stitched with the soul of the moment. We hold these truths to be self-evident. He brought it to the committee. They changed a few lines. Franklin smoothed some phrases. Adams pushed for boldness. Then they brought it to the Congress. The vote came on July the 2nd, unanimous. 12 colonies said yes. New York abstained for now. 2 days later, on July 4th, they adopted the final text. There were no fireworks, no brass bands, just silence, a few nods, and a feeling none of them could quite name. Outside the hall, people waited. In towns across the colonies, the Declaration was read aloud from courthouse steps, in churches, in taverns. Crowds gathered, hats held tight in hand, children hoisted onto shoulders. Some wept, some cheered. Bells rang, kings were cursed. In New York, they pulled down a statue of George III and melted it into bullets. But not everyone celebrated. Loyalists watched in disbelief. Some packed their belongings and left for Canada. Others stayed unsure of what side they were on, or what sides even meant anymore. And in the back of many minds, a quiet fear lingered. Because signing that parchment had done something irreversible. Those 56 names at the bottom, they were more than signatures. They were targets. Had the war been lost, they would have been hanged. Not as soldiers, but as traitors. Jefferson later wrote that the atmosphere in the room had been cool, not celebratory, not triumphant, just heavy. We had declared something entirely new in the history of the world, that all men were created equal, and that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed. We had said it out loud, and there was no taking it back. Even then, the words did not match the world. Slavery still existed. Women had no voice. Indigenous peoples were pushed to the margins. The gap between the ideal and the reality was wide. But the words were there, now etched in ink carried by wind and will across the land. A promise made in the voice of a young, uncertain people who dared to believe they could build something better. It was not a perfect beginning, but it was a beginning. Losing battles, winning hope. The ink on the Declaration had barely dried when reality came crashing down. We had told the world we were free, that we were a new nation, bold and certain. But the British had not left. They had not given up. In truth, they had barely begun to fight. They came back in full force that summer, ships, hundreds of them, darkening the horizon like a storm. Their sails filled New York Harbor, towering over the city like the wings of some ancient beast. Soldiers poured onto the shore, trained, fed, paid, and dressed in flawless red. Washington was there too, waiting, watching. But our army, if you could call it that, was little more than a collection of dreamers. Farmers and tailors, blacksmiths and clerks, barely trained and poorly equipped. Washington had drilled them as best he could, but drills do not harden feet. They do not stop bullets. The British attacked Brooklyn in late August. We fought, but we were outnumbered, outflanked, and outmatched. The fog rolled in thick and cold, and under its cover, Washington pulled off a miracle. He evacuated his entire army across the East River, in silence without a single British cannon finding its mark. Some called it luck, others called it providence. Washington never said, but it was a retreat, and it would not be the last. We lost New York, then Fort Washington, then Fort Lee. Each defeat felt heavier than the last. The British pushed us south through New Jersey, driving us like deer through a winter forest. Morale crumbled. Men deserted. Shoes fell apart. Some soldiers wrapped their feet in rags and left bloody prints in the snow. Congress fled Philadelphia. Confidence flickered, and still Washington stayed. He did not give grand speeches. He was not a man of easy words. But he stood where others would have fallen. He rode through camp at night cloak, pulled tight, nodding to men who had not eaten a real meal in days. He listened more than he spoke. He did not need to say it. We are not done. That December, the army was in tatters, cold, hungry, tired. The war to many seemed lost. The British thought so. They set up winter quarters across the Delaware River. Sure, the rebels would give up before spring. But Washington saw something else a moment. On Christmas night, 1776, as ice floated down the river and the wind bit like teeth, he gathered his men. Wrapped in wool and silence, they climbed into boats and crossed the black waters. On the other side lay Trenton. The Hessians, German soldiers fighting for the British, were sleeping warm and unaware. At dawn, Washington's men struck. Gunfire echoed through the streets. It was quick. It was brutal. And when it was done, nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers were captured. We had won. It was a small battle. In military terms, hardly decisive, but it meant everything. Because what we needed then was not just victory. We needed proof that we could strike back, that we could surprise the world, that we still had breath in our lungs and fire in our bones. After Trenton came Princeton, another quick, sharp victory, and slowly, painfully, the tide began to shift. Not on the battlefield, not yet, but in our minds. We had lost cities, lost ground, lost lives, but we had not lost each other. Back home, people began to believe again, not in an easy war, but in the possibility of something worth suffering for. The Declaration had given us the words, but that cold December in the snow and smoke of battle, we began to earn them. The winter at Valley Forge. There are winters that simply pass, and then there are winters that mark you forever. In December of 1777, the army marched into a place called Valley Forge, a patch of cold land 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. The British had taken the city. Congress had scattered. Supplies were running low. Spirits were even lower. And still Washington led them there. It was not the coldest winter in memory, but for the men who lived through it, it may as well have been the darkest. They built huts from logs and mud one by one, their breath visible in the air. The snow was thin but constant, and the wind found every crack in every wall. Blankets were few. Shoes were torn or missing. Rations came late if they came at all. Sometimes just flour mixed with water browned on a rock near the fire. And there was sickness, so much of it. Dysentery, typhus, smallpox. It spread not like a wave, but like a slow crawling fog. You would hear the cough at night, then the silence by morning. 2,000 men would not make it out of that valley. But those who stayed, those who endured, changed. You could hear it in the way they no longer complained. They were too tired. You could see it in the way they looked at one another, not with despair, but with something harder, sharper. A kind of quiet defiance. Washington was there through all of it. He lived among them. He walked among the huts. He stood beside the fire when it was too wet to light. They saw him each day, tall and calm, never raising his voice, never looking away from the suffering. That mattered more than orders or speeches ever could. And then came a stranger. He arrived on horseback, with a thick accent and a long name, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian officer. He had never commanded a real army, but he knew drills, formations, discipline. He took one look at the army and began to work. He started with a small group, showed them how to march in step, how to reload faster, how to aim with purpose instead of panic. Then those men taught the next, and so on, like a ripple in ice. The army that limped into Valley Forge was not the army that would march out. They came in cold, starving, scattered. They left in spring with order, with purpose, with a bond no enemy could see, but every soldier could feel. And beyond the walls of that camp, something else had shifted. The people back home, farmers, merchants, housewives, had heard about Valley Forge. They sent food coats money, not because they were asked, because they believed, because they felt perhaps for the first time that this fight belonged to all of them. So when the snow began to melt and the birds returned to the trees, the men packed their gear, strapped on their muskets, and stood straighter than they ever had before. They had not won a battle all winter, but they had not broken, and in war sometimes that is the greatest victory of all. The world takes notice. We had been fighting for 3 years, 3 years of smoke and frost hunger and retreat, of whispered hope and shouted orders, and until now we had fought alone. But in 1778 the world finally turned its head. It started with a letter, then many. Letters passed between Philadelphia and Paris, written in careful ink, and carried across oceans by men who knew they might never return. We were asking for something bold help. Guns, ships, money, recognition. A whisper of legitimacy in a world ruled by kings and crowns. And the one we courted most was France. Once Britain's bitter enemy, France had watched our rebellion with fascination and caution. Some in Paris hoped we would succeed, if only to see Britain bleed. Others feared backing a cause so fragile it might collapse with the next snowfall. But then came Saratoga. In October of 1777, in the forests of upstate New York, we had won. It was not just a battle. It was a moment. General Burgoyne's army had marched south, confident and polished. They met resistance, first scattered, then sharp. The Americans, led by Horatio Gates and fueled by local militias, held the line, and then pushed back. When Burgoyne surrendered, he did not just lose 6,000 men. Britain lost its air of invincibility. France saw something different in us after that. They saw possibility. In early 1778, the French signed a treaty of alliance with the United States. Not just a promise of support, but recognition. For the first time, we were not rebels in the wilderness. We were a nation. Small, fragile, but seen. Ships began to cross the Atlantic, not merchant sloops, but warships. French officers arrived, some bearing titles and powdered wigs, others hardened by battle. Among them was the Marquis de Lafayette, a young noble with a heart on fire and a devotion to Washington that would grow deeper than blood. He could have stayed in France, basking in privilege, but he crossed an ocean to fight for a dream that was not yet his. And we welcomed him like a brother. Spain followed quietly, not with a formal alliance, but with aid behind the curtain. Supplies, silver, soldiers in distant lands drawing British forces away from our shores. Suddenly, this was not just a colonial rebellion. It was a global war. The Caribbean lit with conflict. West Africa saw battles. Even India felt the tremble. The sun never set on the British Empire, and now it never slept easy. Back in America, we felt the shift like a change in wind. The redcoats were not leaving, not yet. The war still dragged brutal and slow. But we were no longer outnumbered in every way. We had allies. We had trade. We had hope that no longer needed to be whispered. But it was more than politics. When people in small towns heard of the treaty with France, they lit candles, rang bells, laughed for the first time in weeks. It meant the world was listening, that someone out there believed in us. And when you are cold and tired and wondering why you keep fighting, that belief can carry you a long, long way. Still, nothing was promised. For every friend we gained new enemies too. And the British, they would not go quietly. Not now, not ever. But now, when we stood our ground on hills, in forests, in muddy fields, we no longer stood alone. Spies, letters, and whispers. Not every battle was fought with muskets. Not every hero wore a uniform. Some wars unfold in the quiet, in the space between words, behind shutters drawn against the night, in letters written with invisible ink. As the revolution dragged on, we learned to fight in the shadows. We had to. The British held cities like New York and Charleston. Their troops entrenched their ships guarding the harbors. They moved with confidence, assuming their might would eventually crush our resistance. But even in the heart of their occupied strongholds, their plans were not safe, because we were listening. There was the Culper Ring, a network of spies operating in and around New York City. Farmers, shopkeepers, couriers. They passed messages hidden in laundry lines and baked into bread in codes so clever that even if captured, they could not explain what they carried. The messages went north to General Washington himself. He trusted few, but he trusted them. They used invisible ink. They used aliases. One of the most important agents, we still do not know his name. He signed his messages only as Culper Jr. He may have been a school teacher, or a merchant, or someone we would never suspect. Their work saved lives. They warned Washington of British troop movements. They revealed planned attacks. Once they uncovered a British scheme to flood the market with counterfeit currency, an economic attack meant to starve the revolution, not of blood, but of coin. We stopped it thanks to the whispers in the dark. But it was not just men. Women, too, moved through the war unseen. There was Anna Strong, who hung laundry in a specific pattern to signal messages across the bay. There were housewives who hosted British officers at dinner, while their sons listened from behind walls. There were black women, enslaved and free, who carried news between plantations, hidden in baskets and songs. And children. Young boys who played games in the streets watching, who came and went, memorizing patterns, faces, uniforms. No one suspected a child. The British had spies too. They watched our movements, paid for information, turned soldiers into traders with gold or promises. Not all of them were foreign. Some were Americans loyalists who still believed the crown was just, or who had simply chosen the side they thought would win. We feared them. Because spies do not knock on your door. They do not march in line. They are the ones who smile too easily, who know too much, who disappear when the sun goes down. Even Washington himself was not immune. In 1780, he faced betrayal from one of his most trusted generals, Benedict Arnold. A man once hailed as a hero, now plotting to hand over the fort at West Point to the British. It nearly worked. Had the courier not been caught, had the plan gone through, it might have ended everything. But the courier, Major John Andre, was stopped. captured. His hidden papers found in his boot. He was hanged. Arnold escaped. The betrayal ran deep, deeper than tactics. It shook the army. It shook the general. To fight an enemy in red was one thing. To be stabbed from within, that was something colder. Still, the shadows continued to move, because even as the war raged on battlefields, it also played out in silence. In letters smuggled past checkpoints, in glances exchanged across candlelit rooms, in the courage it took to trust and the fear of trusting the wrong person. There is a kind of bravery in standing in a line of fire, but there is another kind, the kind that walks with a calm face through enemy territory, with secrets sewn into the lining of a coat. The kind that writes a warning by moonlight, signs no name, and disappears into the dark before the sun can rise. Brother against brother. Some wars are drawn along clean lines, this army here, that army there. But ours was not like that. Not always. In our war, the line ran through dinner tables. It cut across towns, down main streets between brothers. You might see two men walking to church on Sunday, each tipping their hat, to the same preacher, each singing the same hymn, and each secretly hoping the other's side would lose. We called ourselves patriots. They called themselves loyalists. But both sides were Americans, and that made everything harder. The loyalists believed in the crown, not out of cowardice, as some said, but out of faith. Faith in tradition, in stability, in the idea that rebellion would only bring ruin. Many had family in Britain. Others owed their wealth or safety to British rule. Some simply feared what might rise if the old order fell. They were not traitors, not to themselves, but to us, those who believed in this new unproven idea of liberty. They were something close to it. In towns like Savannah, Charleston, and New York, loyalists filled the streets. Some took up arms with the British. Others served as guides, informants, scribes. They knew the roads, the terrain, our habits. And when the war came south, as it did in brutal force after 1778, the conflict turned inward. Neighbors burned each other's barns. Sons turned in their fathers. Whole families fled in the night, fearing not the redcoats, but their own former friends. The countryside became a maze of fear. In the Carolinas especially, the violence between patriot and loyalist militias reached a fever pitch. There were raids at midnight, ambushes on church steps, men dragged from their homes. There were no rules there, no uniforms, no formal battles, just blood and revenge. Even in the north, where lines were more clearly drawn, the division lingered in whispers. You might walk past a tailor and wonder whose coat he was stitching. You might sell bread to a man whose gold came from the enemy's hand. And all the while, the war kept grinding forward. Washington knew this fracture could not be ignored. The revolution was not only a fight against an empire, it was a test of unity. And sometimes it felt like we were failing. In some towns, loyalist property was seized. In others, patriots were driven out. In still others, both sides lived uneasily side by side, never speaking of what they believed. Just working the fields, mending fences, trying to keep the children fed, while history tore through their villages. Even families broke. There are letters preserved in archives, and old attic trunks, written between brothers, who would never speak again. One chose the revolution. The other remained loyal, each trying to explain, to plead, to say goodbye, without quite saying it. Some were captured in battle, American against American. There were men who faced each other across a battlefield and recognized a face they once saw at the harvest table, or beside them at church, or teaching them to ride a horse. They fought anyway, because by then, it was not just a war of ideas. It was a war of survival. And wars like that leave scars that last longer than victory. Even after the last battle was fought, the last treaty signed, many Loyalists could not stay. They fled to Canada, to England, to the islands. They left behind farms, friendships, sometimes family. Some never saw their homes again. We talk now of liberty, of revolution, of birth and destiny. But beneath all of that, this war, our war, was also about people. People who had once shared bread, who now shared nothing but silence. It is easy to remember the flags and generals, harder to remember the brothers, but they were there, standing on opposite sides of the same road, watching the same smoke rise into the same sky. The Southern Theater. If the war had burned hot in the North, it began to smolder in the South with a different kind of fire. By 1779, the British had changed their strategy. They believed the South Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, would welcome them. That loyalist sentiment ran deeper there, that with enough pressure, the southern colonies would fold. They were wrong, but not entirely. It began with the fall of Savannah. The Redcoats took the city with little resistance. They planted their flags and began spreading outward, expecting the people to rise up in gratitude. Some did, many did not. Then came Charleston, one of the wealthiest cities in the colonies, a jewel of the South. In May of 1780, it fell after a long siege. Nearly 6,000 American troops surrendered, the largest loss of men in the war. It was a devastating blow. The British marched inland confident again. But the land was not easy. The rivers twisted like veins, the forests closed in thick, and the heat clung to the skin. And the war there, it was no longer neat. It turned into something else. It was a war of ambushes and smoke, of torchlight and pine needles underfoot, of muskets fired from behind trees, and men disappearing into the brush before the echo had faded. It was a war of partisans. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, led one such band. He struck and vanished again and again, cutting supply lines, freeing prisoners, keeping the British nervous and off balance. His men knew the land like it was their own skin. They slept under stars and ate what they could find. They did not wear uniforms, but they fought with a fury born of loss. There were others. Thomas Sumter, the gamecock, fierce and relentless. Andrew Pickens, the wizard owl, quiet and deadly. Names spoken with reverence or fear, depending on which side you were on. The South became a patchwork of fire. Loyalists and patriots hunted each other through the hills. Towns changed hands overnight. Revenge bred revenge. There were no front lines, only places you could pass through, and places you could not. The British underestimated the rage they stirred. At the Battle of Waxhaws, Continental troops under Colonel Buford tried to surrender, but the British cavalry under Banastre Tarleton kept charging. The result was a slaughter. Stories of bayonets thrust into the backs of kneeling men spread like wildfire. Tarleton's quarter, they called it, meaning none. The backlash was swift. Men who had stayed neutral picked up rifles. Fathers joined the cause after burying sons. The brutality of the war no longer felt distant. It had come to their doorsteps, and slowly the tide began to turn. In October of 1780, a group of backcountry militiamen, some from as far as the Appalachian Mountains, faced off against a loyalist force at a place called Kings Mountain. They climbed the slope in silence, rifles in hand, slipping between trees, moving with grim determination. The battle was sharp and short. The loyalists were crushed, their commander killed. Few escaped. It was not just a military victory. It was a message the South would not go quietly. From there, Nathaniel Greene took command of the Southern Continental forces. a quiet man, calm and deliberate. He did not win by standing still. He led his men in long, tireless marches, wearing the British down step by step, forcing them to chase him across broken country until they lost their strength in the mud. The Battle of Cowpens in early 1781 showed what had changed. American forces lured the British in, broke their lines, and scattered them. It was a textbook victory planned with care and carried out with fire. Even Cornwallis, the British general, who had seemed unstoppable, began to question. He pulled back, regrouped, and eventually began to march north. The South had not been won by force. It had been worn down by will, by the people who knew the back roads better than any map, by men and women who buried their dead, then rose to fight, by a land that swallowed armies whole and gave them back as stories. And those stories traveled. Through letters, through song, through campfires and kitchens. They told of a people who refused to be broken, even when the war came to their fields, even when it asked everything of them. And they would follow Cornwallis to Virginia, where the final curtain was waiting. African Americans and the promise of freedom. Freedom was the word on everyone's lips. It was etched into pamphlets, shouted in town squares, stitched into the banners that fluttered above the camps. But freedom, real freedom, was not given equally. From the first musket shot at Lexington, thousands of African Americans, both enslaved and free, had to ask themselves whose freedom was this war truly about. There were no easy answers. For some, the promise came from the British. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, had offered emancipation to any enslaved person who escaped their rebel masters and joined the British Army. It was a bold move, not out of mercy, but strategy. Still, the effect was real. Men and women slipped through swamps and forests by night, leaving behind children, parents, all they knew, for the hope, just the hope, of liberty. Thousands joined the British lines. They dug trenches, served as scouts, carried supplies. Some fought. Others died of disease before they ever touched a weapon. And when the British lost, many were abandoned. Some were taken to Nova Scotia. A few ended up in Sierra Leone. Others were re-enslaved by the very same empire that had promised them something better. But not all who sought freedom turned north. In the Continental Army, free black men enlisted early. From Massachusetts to New York to Rhode Island, they stood in the ranks with their white comrades. Some were musicians, some were laborers, many were soldiers, true soldiers. Peter Salem, a formerly enslaved man, fought at Bunker Hill and may have fired the shot that killed Major Pitcairn, the British officer who had once tried to disarm the rebels. Salem Poor distinguished himself in battle so profoundly that 14 officers wrote a petition to Congress praising his bravery. They called him a brave and gallant soldier. In 1778, Rhode Island created a regiment composed largely of black troops, offering enslaved men their freedom in exchange for service. Many accepted. Some died wearing uniforms that declared them part of a country that had not yet decided if they belonged. The ideals of the Revolution, liberty, justice, self-governance rippled through the minds of all who heard them. For white colonists, these were rallying cries. For black Americans, they were both hope and heartbreak, because the contradiction was stark. Men who signed the Declaration of Independence owned human beings. Men who spoke of inalienable rights walked past shackles on their way to Congress. The words, "all men are created," equal rang through a land where men were bought and sold. And still, African Americans fought, not just for a country, but for a chance that maybe in the ashes of empire, something new could grow, something better. They cooked meals and carried powder. They wrote poetry and dug earthworks. They spied. They stood guard. They bled. And after the war, they asked the question that would not go away. What does freedom mean if it is not for everyone? Some gained their liberty. Others were returned to bondage. In the North, a slow, stumbling path toward emancipation began. In the South, the institution of slavery tightened its grip. But the promise had been spoken now. It lived in the minds of those who had heard it, even if their chains had not yet been broken. And that promise would not be forgotten. Not by the men who fought, not by the women who waited, not by the children who watched the flags rise and wondered if one day they too would be free. Women in the shadows. They did not march in formation. They did not write declarations. They did not sign treaties or command regiments. But they were there every step, every winter, every battlefield, every letter home. Women were the steady breath beneath the revolution's roar. In the cities, they ran the shops their husbands had left behind. They baked bread with what little flour remained, stretched candles and cloth-sewed uniforms until their fingers bled. They tended the wounded in makeshift hospitals and comforted children whose fathers might never return. In the countryside, they did even more. They planted crops, kept the animals alive, negotiated with merchants and soldiers alike. They defended their homes with axes and muskets when the war came too close. Some even rode as couriers, weaving through forests and creeks, with messages tucked into their hems. And they waited. Through winters like Valley Forge, through summers when no letters came. They waited with hearts heavier than cannonballs. Some did not just wait. Some stepped forward. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and enlisted in the Continental Army. She fought beside the others, slept beside them, bled beside them. When she was wounded, she tended to her injuries alone, afraid to be discovered. It was over a year before anyone knew. Margaret Corbin took her husband's place at a cannon after he fell at Fort Washington. She fired until she was shot herself. Congress would later grant her a pension, the first for a woman wounded in combat. There were others whose names we will never know. The women who cooked for whole camps, over open fires, who whispered warnings when British soldiers passed through, who smuggled messages in baskets and babies' blankets, who sang lullabies in dark rooms, not knowing if the next knock on the door would bring news or soldiers. Some were enslaved. They worked in homes and fields, watched the war pass overhead, wondering which side, if any, would carry them toward freedom. Others were loyalists who lost husbands to the gallows, or exile who watched as their property was seized and their names erased. The war made no promises to them, but they bore its weight all the same. And some were mothers like Mary Draper, who melted her pewter plates into musket balls and handed them to passing soldiers. Or wives like Lucy Knox, who followed her husband Henry from camp to camp, bringing books and blankets and a stubborn sense of civilization. They kept diaries. They wrote letters. They buried the dead. They lived the revolution in the everyday, not in grand speeches, but in quiet endurance, not in medals, but in moments wringing water from linens, calming fevered brows, standing tall when their sons trembled. And when the war ended, they were asked to return to silence, to step back into roles they had outgrown, to pretend the world had not changed them. But it had. They had seen too much, done too much, held the weight of a nation still being born. So even if the history books wrote them in margins, the truth was never lost. The revolution did not march forward on legs alone. It was carried in great part by hands that never let go. turning the tide. By 1780, the war had worn thin, not just on uniforms or maps or broken roads, but on the people themselves. 7 years had passed since the first tensions had sparked in Boston, 5 since the shots at Lexington, and still there was no clear end in sight. The British held cities, the Americans held hope, and hope for all its power was beginning to fray. The Southern campaign had taken a toll. Charleston had fallen. Savannah was gone. Cornwallis was pushing north, and though his army was bloodied, it was moving with brutal efficiency. But something had begun to change. It did not feel like a miracle, more like a slow, stubborn shift, like the sea pulling back before the wave. Little victories barely noticed at first began to pile up. Skirmishes where the redcoats stumbled, raids where supplies were captured. Morale, once hollowed out, started to fill again, quietly, steadily. In the North, General Washington continued his long, patient struggle. He did not chase glory. He chased order, discipline, preparation. He kept his army alive in a world that seemed determined to see it vanish. He wrote letters by candlelight. He listened more than he spoke. He watched. In the South, Nathaniel Greene played a different game. Greene did not try to defeat the British outright. He made them bleed slowly. He split his forces. He harassed their lines. He fought when it made sense and fled when it did not. Each step Cornwallis took brought more resistance, more ghosts in the trees, more roads that led nowhere. The Battle of Cowpens was a turning point. In January 1781, General Daniel Morgan, a wiry, tough veteran, faced a larger British force under Banastre Tarleton. Morgan knew his men militia who fired fast, but rarely stood their ground. So he planned for it. He placed the militia up front and told them to fire twice, then fall back. The British, thinking they had the Americans on the run, charged straight into the trap. Behind the retreating militia stood seasoned Continental troops, calm and ready. The line held. The British line broke. In less than an hour, Tarleton's force was shattered. It was not just a victory, it was a message. The Americans could outthink them now, outmaneuver them, and sometimes outfight them. Cornwallis, stung and weary, pressed north into Virginia, hoping to regroup to connect with reinforcements to end the war once and for all. But Washington had been waiting, and so had France. The alliance that had once seemed only symbolic had now become very real. French troops led by the noble and tireless Rochambeau had marched hundreds of miles to meet the Continental Army. French ships crossed the Atlantic again, this time, not with promises, but with power. And always, there was Lafayette. Still barely out of boyhood, still burning with idealism, Lafayette shadowed Cornwallis's movements across Virginia. He wrote to Washington, constantly urging him to act, to strike to end it. Washington hesitated, then decided. In a moment of daring and calculation, he marched his army south from New York. Over 500 miles in a matter of weeks, the soldiers moving fast and quiet dust rising behind them. They left behind campfires and fake messages to trick the British into thinking they remained in the north. It worked. By the time Cornwallis realized what was coming, it was too late. He had made camp at a coastal town called Yorktown, a place he believed was safe, but the tide had turned, and now it was coming for him. Yorktown. The final siege. Yorktown sat on a bluff above the Chesapeake Bay, its streets lined with small houses and red-coated soldiers who believed, perhaps, they were simply waiting out the final act of the war. Cornwallis had chosen it for its position, easy to defend by land, and more importantly, easy to escape by sea. He did not know that the sea would soon betray him. By late September 1781, the trap had been set. Washington's army, nearly 9,000 strong, marched south, with French troops beside them. They moved with purpose, but also with something deeper. The weight of years, the memory of loss, the quiet hope that maybe this was the end. From the sea came Admiral de Grasse, leading a powerful French fleet. His ships clashed with the British Navy at the mouth of the bay, and held. The British retreat route by water was gone. The land behind Cornwallis was already closing. The noose had tightened. Washington arrived and surveyed the British defenses, earthworks, cannons, trenches. It was not impregnable, but it would not fall easily. So they dug. Lines of Americans and French soldiers shoulder to shoulder under moonlight and gunfire carved the siege trenches inch by inch. Dirt covered their hands, their coats, their faces. The nights were loud with artillery, but they kept digging. They knew the pattern. Washington had taught them patience. By October 9th, the bombardment began. From land and sea, the Allied cannons opened fire. The ground shook for days. British redoubts were torn apart. The sky over Yorktown filled with smoke, and the air burned with sulfur and fear. Washington usually reserved, personally ordered, the final assaults. On the night of October 14th, they attacked two key British positions. One was taken by the French, the other by Americans, led by Alexander Hamilton, eager to prove himself in battle, after years of pen and paper. They charged with bayonets, no shots fired through the dark, through mud and musket fire. The redoubt fell in minutes. Cornwallis was cornered. He tried to evacuate across the York River, but a sudden storm scattered his boats. He sent word to London. He waited. On October 17th, a drummer appeared on the British side. Then a white flag. 2 days later, the surrender was formal. Cornwallis did not attend the ceremony. He claimed illness. His second-in-command offered the sword first to Rochambeau, who declined, then to Washington, who also refused. It was finally accepted by Washington's own second, Benjamin Lincoln, who had once surrendered Charleston to the British, and now watched the moment circle back. The British troops marched out, their drums playing "The World Turned Upside Down." And in many ways it had. In the camps that night, soldiers wept. Not for joy exactly, but for the release, for the long wait finally lifting, for the friends they had lost, for the possibility of something beyond war. Word spread slowly, but when it came, church bells rang across the colonies. In towns where victory had seemed impossible, just a year before, people lit candles, embraced strangers, and dared to believe. The war was not yet officially over. Diplomats still had to argue in distant rooms. But Yorktown was the last great battle. And though there would still be hardship, still be division, still be wounds, that did not close on that field, in that autumn light the world changed. The empire had blinked, and a nation had begun to breathe. The war ends, but peace takes time. After Yorktown, the guns fell mostly silent, but silence, we soon learned, is not the same as peace. The British still held New York, Savannah, and Charleston. Their ships still ruled much of the sea, and while Cornwallis had surrendered, the war was not yet finished on paper, or in the hearts of many who had given too much to let go so easily. Washington remained cautious. He did not declare victory. He kept the army intact, drilling, watching, waiting. The war had shifted into a strange, uncertain pause. There were no great battles, only skirmishes, only rumors, only time. Across the Atlantic, diplomats gathered in Paris. Benjamin Franklin was there, older now, slower, but as sharp as ever. John Adams, too, and John Jay. They sat across from British negotiators in candle-lit rooms, surrounded by maps and ink-stained documents. They argued over borders, Debts, fishing rights, over language and honor, over the shape of a world none of them could quite define. It took months. But on September 3, 1783, they signed the Treaty of Paris. The British recognized the independence of the United States of America. That sentence on paper was a thunderclap. The war was over, or so it was said. But when the news reached America, it arrived like a tide, slow, steady, carrying with it relief and confusion. There were no parades, no fireworks, just a long exhale after a breath held far too long. The British lingered in New York until November. When they finally left their ships cutting across the harbor, American soldiers marched in. George Washington rode quietly into the city, hailed by cheering crowds. But he did not stay long. He had one more farewell to make. At Fraunce's Tavern, on a gray December morning, he gathered his officers, the men who had stood with him through frost and hunger, through defeat and doubt. Many were crying. Washington raised a glass voice, trembling, and said only this: "With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you." Then he turned, embraced each man in silence, and walked out the door. He did not seek power. He gave it away. He traveled to Annapolis, where the Continental Congress met. There, in a moment that stunned the world, he resigned his commission. A general who had led a revolution walked away from command and returned to private life. Kings did not do that. But Washington was not a king. And now the real work began. The war had ended, yes. But the country it left behind was not a country yet, not really. It was a patchwork of debts and disagreements, fragile alliances, and exhausted people. There was no central government strong enough to lead. The Articles of Confederation, hastily written during the war, offered unity, in name only. There were uprisings, farmers in Massachusetts, veterans unpaid, and hungry stormed courthouses in frustration. States bickered like siblings. Foreign powers watched, wondering if this new United States would tear itself apart before it even took a breath. And yet there was something else in the air, too. An idea that had survived gunpowder and doubt. A belief, unsteady, imperfect but alive, that people could govern themselves. The war had taken 8 years. It had claimed tens of thousands of lives. It had broken families, burned homes, and redrawn the world. But it had also planted a seed. Now the question was whether we could nurture it, whether we could build a nation worthy of the cost. Peace, we realized, was not a gift at the end of war. It was a burden, and it would be up to us to carry it. The birth of a nation. We had won the war, but we had not yet won the right to call ourselves a nation. Victory had left us with independence, but not unity. 13 colonies now, 13 states were bound more by memory than by law. Each guarded its own interests. Each feared giving up too much. And though we spoke of liberty, no one quite agreed on what that should look like when the cannons fell silent. The Articles of Confederation. Our first attempt at a national government were full of hope and holes. There was no president, no federal courts, no power to raise taxes or regulate trade, just a Congress that could suggest, but not enforce, ask, but not demand. It had been enough during the war, barely. But now, with peace, it was coming apart. Veterans went unpaid. Merchants were blocked by conflicting tariffs from state to state. Foreign nations doubted our staying power. And at home, people began to ask, had we traded one kind of chaos for another? In 1786, unrest flared in Massachusetts. Daniel Shays, a former soldier, led hundreds of farmers in protest against debt taxes and the seizure of their land. The uprising Shays Rebellion was put down, but it rattled the country. If this could happen so soon after independence, what might come next? Leaders began to whisper, then speak aloud about something radical starting over. A constitutional convention was called for the spring of 1787. In Philadelphia, behind closed windows and sweltering summer heat, delegates gathered. They came from every state but Rhode Island. They were lawyers, farmers, generals, philosophers. Most were young. Many were scarred by war. George Washington was chosen to preside. His presence alone gave the room weight. James Madison, quiet but relentless, came with a plan, the Virginia Plan. It would form the backbone of what became our Constitution. Others debated fiercely large states versus small North versus South federal strength versus individual freedom. For 4 long months they argued about how to balance power, about how to choose leaders, about what kind of country this should be, not just in the moment, but for generations. And in the end, they signed. Not all were satisfied. Some feared it gave too much power to a central government. Others feared it did not go far enough. But it was a beginning. The Constitution was sent to the states for ratification, and the debate spread like wildfire. Newspapers printed arguments for and against it. In taverns and churches, people took sides. The Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton Madison and Jay, made the case for a stronger union. Opponents warned of tyranny cloaked in new robes. But slowly, state by state, the tide turned. By 1788, 9 states had ratified it. That was enough. And so, in the spring of 1789, the nation held its breath as George Washington took the oath of office on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. He did not want power. He had not campaigned. But he accepted because the country needed someone steady, someone trusted to carry it forward. There were no parties then, no motorcades, no inaugurations broadcast to the world, just a man, his hand on the Bible, his voice clear, "I do solemnly swear." And with those words, something truly new began. Not perfect, not finished, but alive. A republic not of kings, but of laws. Not built on bloodlines, but on ideas. A government of the people, by the people, for the people. It was fragile. It still is. But in that moment, in that breath, between war and peace, we became something we had only dreamed of. We became a nation. What freedom really meant. The revolution had promised freedom. But freedom, like all promises, depends on who is listening and who is left out. The words of the Declaration had soared, "All men are created equal." But in the quiet after the war, many began to ask, which men, whose freedom? What kind? For white landowning men, the answer was simple. They could vote, hold office, build lives in a country now, built at least in part in their image. But for others, the road to freedom was far more complicated. Enslaved people who had heard the call of liberty and often fought for it on both sides of the war remained bound. In the North, some states began slow, painful steps toward emancipation. Laws were passed to free children born after a certain date, but the process was glacial, and freedom was never immediate, never full. In the South, slavery deepened. Cotton would soon become king, and the founding documents that had declared liberty as a right remained silent on bondage. Some of the very men who wrote and signed those words owned other human beings. Jefferson, Madison, Washington himself. They wrestled with the contradiction, sometimes in writing, sometimes in silence. But the contradiction remained. For women, the war had opened a door, but not quite wide enough to step through. They had managed farms, defended homes, served as nurses, messengers, even disguised soldiers. They had written letters and essays, some pleading for greater rights. Abigail Adams had written to her husband, John, remember the ladies, but they were not remembered, not in law, not in governance. After the war, women returned to lives confined by tradition. They could not vote. They could not hold office. Their legal identities were often absorbed into their husbands. Still, something had shifted. Quietly, girls were educated in greater numbers. Women spoke more boldly in public spaces. A seed had been planted, one that would take generations to flower. Native American nations, too, watched the revolution unfold with wariness. Some tribes sided with the British, hoping to protect their homelands from settler expansion. Others remained neutral or fractured from within. But after the war, their lands were not protected. Treaties were made and broken. Boundaries were drawn without their consent. And the expansion of this new nation often came at the cost of their sovereignty, their homes, their lives. The revolution had declared a new birth of freedom. But for many, it was not yet a life they could claim. And yet, despite all of this, something powerful had been unleashed, an idea that governments derived their power not from blood or divine right, but from the consent of the governed. That rights were not privileges, that people, ordinary, imperfect, stubborn people, could shape their own destiny. That idea took root. It inspired revolutions in France, in Haiti, in Latin America. It echoed across oceans and decades, and even those denied its full promise still heard its call. In the years to come, abolitionists would wield those founding words like weapons. Suffragists would march beneath banners quoting Jefferson. Native leaders would remind America of its own pledges. Because if liberty was worth fighting for, then it was worth expanding. The revolution had not finished the work, but it had begun it. And in that beginning, we were not just declaring independence from a king. We were declaring the long, unfinished struggle to become what we had claimed to be. Legacies and Echoes. Revolutions do not end when the guns go silent. They echo through time, through people, through places that may never know the names of the battles, but carry the shape of their consequences. The American Revolution had been improbable, a ragged coalition of colonies defeating the world's greatest empire. It had seemed like a dream, and then it became a model. In France, just a few years after Yorktown, the people rose up against monarchy. They had watched what we did from across the Atlantic, studied our declarations, envied our rebellion. Their revolution would be far bloodier, more radical, more consuming. But it was born in part from the same spark. In Haiti, enslaved people who had heard of liberty, not just as a word, but as a possibility, took that spark and lit their own fire. In 1791, they began a revolt that would become the first successful slave uprising in the Western Hemisphere. It shook the world. In South America, leaders like Simón Bolívar dreamed of republics, of freedom from empire. They too looked to the American example, not as a blueprint, but as proof that empires could be challenged, that history could bend. And at home in the United States, the echoes never stopped. The Constitution became law. The Bill of Rights followed 10 amendments, spelling out freedoms we now hold as sacred speech. Religion pressed the right to a fair trial, the right to assemble, to bear arms, to refuse tyranny. But even then, not all was settled. The revolution had stitched together 13 states, but the seams were fragile. The questions left unanswered about slavery, about federal power, about who truly belonged, would crack wide open in time. Nearly a century later, those same tensions would ignite a civil war. Yet the legacy of 1776 endured. In every movement that followed abolition, women's suffrage, civil rights, you can hear its heartbeat. In every courtroom where justice is argued, in every town meeting where citizens gather to raise their voices. It's there. Even when we fall short, and we have many times, we still reach toward the promise, made in that summer long ago, that people could govern themselves, that power could rest not in thrones, but in hands, that freedom was not the gift of kings, but the right of the people. Of course, legacies are not perfect. The men we call founders were brilliant, yes, but also flawed. They dreamed of liberty while holding others in chains. They spoke of equality, yet feared too much democracy. They shaped a nation, but left it incomplete. And still they left us something more than a country. They left us a challenge to continue the work, to close the distance between the ideals they wrote and the reality we live, because that is what the revolution truly gave us, not just a beginning, but a direction. And even now, centuries later, we are still walking that road, still arguing, still striving, still stumbling forward in the long shadow of that first bold step. Good night, America. So now the story comes to rest. From quiet fields in New England to the crowded streets of Philadelphia, from snow-choked camps to distant treaty halls, we have followed it together. The long winding path of a revolution, born not just in muskets and marches, but in ideas, ideas that were fragile, contradictory, incomplete, and yet powerful enough to reshape the world. The American Revolution was never simple. It was not clean or pure or perfect. It was made by people, real people, flawed and tired, brave and afraid. Some names we remember: Washington, Franklin, Hamilton, Jefferson. Others we do not: the farmer at Concord, the seamstress in Boston, the drummer boy at Yorktown. And some too many were never written down at all. But they were there. They were all there. They bled. They waited. They hoped. And in doing so, they did something extraordinary. They imagined a nation that had never existed before. And then, through sacrifice and fire, they built it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to hand it forward to us. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember that this country, our country, did not appear fully formed. It was made piece by piece, decision by decision, heartbeat by heartbeat, and it still is. Because freedom is not something we inherit once. It is something we remake again and again, with courage, with care, and with the quiet belief that we are capable of more. So rest now. The drums have faded. The fire burns low. The story will wait until morning. Good night, America, and thank you for listening.